Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. James Carlton sat in his sleek, modern office, the city skyline of New York glimmering outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. His desk was clutter-free, save for a single holographic display hovering above it, showing the profile of his latest client. He was a man in his late 40s, a tech mogul known for his sharp mind and relentless ambition. The client's request was straightforward: he wanted to purchase a new consciousness. Specifically, he needed the mind of a mathematical genius to solve a problem his best engineers had been struggling with for years. James had made a name for himself in the world of consciousness trading, a burgeoning industry that allowed the rich and powerful to enhance their own abilities by acquiring the cognitive skills of others. It was a job that required a certain moral flexibility, but James had always justified it to himself. The people selling their consciousnesses were compensated handsomely, and those who bought them were using them to further human progress, or so he told himself. As he reviewed the details of the transaction, a name popped up on the screen: Emily Rose. She was young, barely out of university, but she was a prodigy. Her work in theoretical mathematics had already garnered attention from some of the top minds in the field. But there was a note attached to her profile that made James pause: financial distress. Willing to sell full consciousness. James leaned back in his chair, a sense of unease creeping over him. Full consciousness transfers were rare. Most people only sold specific skills or memories. A full transfer meant the seller would lose everything: their personality, memories, even their sense of self. They would become a shell, a living body with no mind of its own. It was a fate worse than death for many, but for those in desperate situations, it was a way out. He stared at Emily's profile, a mixture of admiration and pity washing over him. She was brilliant, but also vulnerable. The system had failed her, and now she was about to be consumed by it. He had seen it happen before, but this time, it felt different. This time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The transaction was simple enough. The client would pay an exorbitant amount of money, Emily would undergo the transfer, and her consciousness would be integrated into the client's mind. It would enhance his cognitive abilities, allowing him to solve problems that had stumped his team for years. It was a win-win, at least on paper. James hesitated. He had never thought much about the ethical implications of his work before. The clients were happy, the sellers were compensated, and he made a small fortune facilitating the transactions. But something about Emily's case gnawed at him. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen to her after the transfer, what kind of life she would have, or if she would even be considered alive. He reached out to Emily through the secure communication line provided in her profile. Her holographic image appeared before him, flickering slightly as the connection stabilized. She looked tired, her eyes hollow, but there was a fire in them that hadn't been completely extinguished. "Emily, thank you for speaking with me," James began, his voice measured and calm. "I understand you've agreed to a full consciousness transfer. I just wanted to confirm that you're aware of what that entails." She nodded, her expression resigned. "I know. It's not ideal, but I don't have much of a choice. The debt is crushing me, and this is the only way out." James frowned. "You realize that after the transfer, you won't be the same person. You'll lose everything: your memories, your sense of self. You'll be giving up your life as you know it." Her gaze hardened. "I know what I'm giving up, Mr. Carlton. But what other options do I have? The world doesn't care about people like me. It chews us up and spits us out. This way, at least I'm leaving something behind, something that might make a difference." He couldn't argue with her logic, but it didn't sit right with him. There must be another way. "You're too talented to just disappear." Emily's eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked vulnerable, like the young woman she was. "I've considered every option, James. This is the best one. At least this way, my work will live on. I'll live on, in some form." James ended the call with a heavy heart. He could proceed with the transaction, as he had done countless times before, or he could try to find another solution, one that didn't involve sacrificing a brilliant young mind to the whims of the rich and powerful. For the first time in his career, James found himself questioning the morality of what he did. The industry he had thrived in was built on the exploitation of the desperate and the vulnerable, people like Emily who had no other way out. He had always justified it by telling himself that it was a fair exchange, but now he wasn't so sure. Days passed, and James became more and more consumed by his doubts. He started looking into other cases, other transactions he had facilitated. He found patterns, people who had sold their consciousness only to be discarded by society afterward, their lives reduced to empty shells. He saw the widening gap between the rich and the poor, how the powerful used these transactions to amass even more power while the rest of society suffered. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The industry was corrupt, and he was complicit in it. But what could he do? He was just one man, and the system was so deeply entrenched that it seemed impossible to change. Then he received an encrypted message. It was from a journalist, someone who had been investigating consciousness trading for years. The journalist had evidence, proof that the industry was far more sinister than anyone had realized. There were whispers of a shadowy organization using consciousness trading to control the minds of influential figures in politics and business, manipulating them to serve their own ends. The journalist wanted to expose the truth, but they needed someone on the inside, someone with access to the industry's inner workings. James was their best chance. He knew that getting involved would be dangerous. The people behind the organization wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their plans. But he also knew that if he did nothing, the exploitation and corruption would continue, and more people like Emily would be consumed by the system. James agreed to help. He began gathering evidence, secretly recording conversations, accessing restricted databases, and compiling a dossier that would expose the dark underbelly of consciousness trading. It was a risky game, and he knew that if he were caught, it would mean the end of everything, his career, his life, everything, but he couldn't turn back. The more he uncovered, the more determined he became. This wasn't just about Emily anymore, it was about justice for all the people who had been exploited, all the lives that had been destroyed by the greed and ambition of the powerful. As he worked with the journalist, they began to piece together a picture of the organization behind the consciousness trading industry. It was vast, reaching into every corner of society, with ties to governments, corporations, and criminal enterprises. The organization used consciousness trading to gain control over key figures, bending them to their will and shaping the world to their liking. James and the journalist knew they had to act quickly. The longer they waited, the more dangerous it became. They decided to go public, to release the evidence they had gathered to the media and let the world see the truth. But the organization was one step ahead. They had been watching James, and they knew what he was planning. On the eve of their big reveal, James received a warning, an anonymous message telling him to stop, or face the consequences. He knew it was a threat, but he couldn't back down now. He had come too far, and there were too many lives at stake. He contacted the journalist, and they agreed to move forward with the plan, despite the risks. The next day, the story broke. The media was flooded with reports about the organization, about the corruption and exploitation at the heart of the consciousness trading industry. The public was outraged, and governments around the world were forced to take action. But the organization didn't go down without a fight. They launched a smear campaign against James, accusing him of fabricating evidence, of being part of a rival group trying to take over the consciousness trading industry. They used their influence to silence journalists and manipulate public opinion. James found himself in the crosshairs. His reputation was destroyed, his career in ruins. He was hounded by the media, targeted by the organization's operatives, and left with nowhere to turn, but he didn't regret his decision. He knew that what he had done was right, that he had fought for something greater than himself. And in the end, that was what mattered. The organization might have won the battle, but James had lit a spark. People were questioning the ethics of consciousness trading, demanding change. The industry was under scrutiny like never before, and the world was starting to wake up to the dangers it posed. As James stood in the ruins of his life, he knew that the fight wasn't over. The organization was still out there, still pulling the strings, but now they were exposed. And as long as there were people willing to stand up against them, there was hope. In the end, James had lost everything, but he had gained something far more valuable, his conscience. He had made the choice to do what was right, even when it meant sacrificing everything. And as he looked out at the city, he knew that he would continue to fight, no matter the cost. He had become more than just a consciousness trader, he had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed it. James walked through the dimly lit streets, his collar turned up against the cold wind that whipped through the city. The world around him had changed since the story broke. The media frenzy had died down, but the tension in the air was palpable. People had begun to question the very fabric of the society they lived in, and James could feel the weight of those questions pressing down on him as he moved through the crowds. He had become a pariah. The smear campaign had been effective. Most people believed the lies spun by the organization. His name was synonymous with betrayal, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. But he had no regrets. He had done what needed to be done, and if he had to live with the consequences, so be it. The journalist who had worked with him had gone underground, fearing for their life. The organization had far-reaching tentacles, and anyone associated with exposing them was in danger. James had received threats too, vague warnings, sinister messages left in his apartment, but they didn't scare him anymore. He had nothing left to lose. As he turned a corner, he caught sight of a figure standing in the shadows, waiting. James's instincts kicked in, his heart rate spiking as he slowed his pace. The figure stepped forward, revealing a familiar face. It was Emily. She looked different from the last time he had seen her, before the transfer. Her eyes were sharp, her movements confident, but there was something about her that seemed off. The transfer had happened, that much was clear, but what stood before him was not the same Emily he had known. "James," she said, her voice calm but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. "We need to talk." He approached cautiously, keeping his guard up. "Emily, or whoever you are now. I wasn't expecting to see you again." She gave a small, tight-lipped smile. "I'm still me, in a way. But I'm also more." The transfer didn't go as planned. Something happened during the process. James frowned, trying to make sense of her words. "What do you mean?" "The transfer should have completely erased your original consciousness." "That's what was supposed to happen," she said, her tone hardening. "But there was a glitch. A malfunction in the system. Part of me, my original consciousness, merged with the new one. I'm not just Emily anymore, but I'm not just the client either. I'm both." James's mind raced as he processed what she was saying. This was unheard of. The technology wasn't supposed to work like this. Merging two consciousnesses was a concept that had been explored theoretically but had always been dismissed as too dangerous, too unpredictable. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I came to warn you," she replied, her eyes locking onto his. "The organization knows you're still a threat. They're planning something big, something that could change everything. They think they've won, but they're just getting started." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What are they planning?" "I don't have all the details," she admitted. "But from what I've gathered, they're working on a new kind of consciousness transfer, one that doesn't just enhance the buyer but also allows for full control over their actions. They want to create an army of obedient, intelligent minds that they can control remotely." "That's insane," James muttered, more to himself than to her. "They're playing God. And they're close to succeeding," she said, stepping closer. "We have to stop them, James. You exposed them once, but that only made them more dangerous. Now, they're more determined than ever to see their plans through." James nodded, a sense of determination settling over him. He had been content to let things lie after the initial exposure, thinking he had done his part. But now, he realized that the fight was far from over. If what Emily, or whoever she was, said was true, then the stakes were even higher than before. "Do you have any proof?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not yet. But I know where to find it. There's a facility, one of their secret labs, where they're conducting the experiments. If we can get inside, we can gather the evidence we need to expose them again, this time with no room for denial." James considered her words. Breaking into one of the organization's labs was a suicide mission, but he knew it was the only way. The world needed to see the full extent of what was happening, and the only way to do that was to bring back undeniable proof. "I'll help you," he said finally. "But we need a plan." She smiled, and for a moment, he saw a glimpse of the old Emily, the one who had been so full of life and potential. "I've already got one." The two of them spent the next few hours in a small, dingy apartment that James had been using as a safe house. Emily laid out the details of the lab's security, the shifts of the guards, the layout of the building. It was a heavily fortified facility, but there were weak points, places where they could slip in undetected if they were careful. As they went over the plan, James couldn't help but notice the way Emily's mannerisms had changed. She was sharper, more confident, but also colder. The warmth that had once been in her eyes was gone, replaced by something more mechanical, more calculating. It was as if the two consciousnesses within her were constantly at odds, struggling for dominance. "You're sure you're up for this?" he asked, concern edging into his voice. "I have to be," she replied without hesitation. "This is bigger than both of us. If we don't stop them, who knows what kind of world we'll be living in." James nodded, knowing she was right. They were on the brink of something catastrophic, and it was up to them to prevent it. The night of the break-in, James and Emily moved through the shadows like ghosts, avoiding the security cameras and slipping past the guards undetected. The facility loomed ahead of them, a monolithic structure of steel and glass, its windows dark and impenetrable. They reached the side entrance, where Emily used a device she had acquired to bypass the electronic lock. The door clicked open, and they slipped inside, the silence of the building almost deafening. Inside, the facility was a labyrinth of sterile corridors and secure rooms. They moved quickly but cautiously, avoiding detection as they made their way to the central lab where the experiments were taking place. When they finally reached the lab, James felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the moment of truth. Emily hacked into the lab's security system, disabling the alarms and unlocking the door. They stepped inside, and what they saw stopped them in their tracks. The lab was filled with rows of pods, each containing a person in a state of suspended animation. Wires and tubes connected their bodies to a central computer, which was monitoring their brain activity. It was clear that these were the subjects of the new experiments, people whose consciousnesses had been altered, merged, or controlled in ways that defied comprehension. James approached one of the pods, peering inside at the person within. It was a young man, his face peaceful but devoid of any sign of life. He looked like he was sleeping, but James knew better. This was no ordinary sleep, this was a state of complete mind control. "We need to get the data from the central computer," Emily said, pulling James out of his thoughts. She moved to the terminal and began downloading the files they needed, her fingers flying over the keyboard with a precision that was almost inhuman. As the files transferred, James kept watch, his nerves on edge. The facility was too quiet, something didn't feel right. "Almost done," Emily muttered, her eyes fixed on the screen. Just as the download completed, alarms blared throughout the facility. Red lights flashed, and a robotic voice announced a security breach. "They know we're here," James said, drawing his weapon. "We need to move, now." Emily grabbed the data drive, and they bolted from the lab, racing through the corridors as security forces closed in on them. The building was a maze, and they had to rely on their instincts to navigate it, taking sharp turns and ducking through side passages to evade capture. They burst through an emergency exit and into the night, the cold air hitting them like a wall. The facility's perimeter alarms were blaring, but they didn't stop running until they were far enough away to catch their breath. James glanced back at the facility, now a distant blur of lights and noise. "We got what we came for, but they'll be coming after us." Emily nodded, her face grim. "Then we'll have to stay one step ahead." We need to get this data to the public before they can bury it. They disappeared into the night, the weight of what they had just witnessed hanging heavily between them. The organization was more powerful and more dangerous than they had ever imagined, but they had the proof they needed to bring it down. Over the next few days, James and Emily worked tirelessly, using every contact and resource they had to leak the data to the media. The response was immediate and explosive. The public was horrified by the revelations, and governments around the world were forced to take action, but the organization fought back with everything they had, using their influence to discredit the leaks, spread misinformation, and target James and Emily with relentless attacks. It became a game of cat and mouse, with James and Emily always on the move, always looking over their shoulders. Despite the danger, they pushed forward, determined to see this through to the end. They knew that the world needed to know the truth, no matter the cost, but the organization was relentless, and their resources were limitless. They tracked James and Emily to a safe house in the outskirts of the city, launching a coordinated assault to silence them once and for all. The final confrontation was brutal and chaotic. James and Emily fought back with everything they had, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The safe house was destroyed, and James was gravely injured in the attack. As he lay on the cold ground, bleeding and fading in and out of consciousness, Emily knelt beside him. Her eyes, once so full of determination, were now filled with despair. "You can't die here, James," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We still have a chance. We can still stop them." But James knew it was too late. He could feel his life slipping away, the pain in his body overwhelming. He reached out, gripping her hand with the last of his strength. "You have to finish this," he said, his voice weak but resolute. "You're the only one left." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, she was the old Emily again, the young woman who had once been full of hope and dreams. "I don't know if I can do it alone." "You're not alone," he murmured, his voice growing faint. "You have the strength of two minds. Use it." With those final words, James's hand slipped from hers, and his eyes closed for the last time. Emily sat there, holding his hand, the weight of his sacrifice pressing down on her. The world had lost a good man, but his fight wasn't over. It was now up to her to carry on, to ensure that his death wasn't in vain. She stood, her resolve hardening. She would finish what they had started. She would bring the organization down, no matter what it took. They had taken everything from her, from both of her consciousnesses, but they would never take her will to fight. Emily disappeared into the night, her path set. The world was still teetering on the brink of disaster, but as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep fighting. The organization would fall, and the truth would prevail. She would make sure of it.